Okay, you're on, Gillian.
Good afternoon. This afternoon, I'm just to give you a brief update on the status of the Florida standards and the Executive Order 19-32 announced by Governor DeSantis on January 31st. Essentially, on January 31st, the governor announced the elimination of the Common Core standards. Just for some backstory, the standards that we use in Florida are called the Florida standards. However, when crosswalk, they share a significant percentage of standards that are similar to those of the Common Core. So I think for the purposes of the executive order, the governor was using both of those terms interchangeably. Essentially, the ELA standards only have a cursive handwriting differential Florida has versus Common Core, and the calculus standards are the only significant difference in the Common Core / Florida standards debate at the high school level. With all of that being said, what the governor has done is required the legislature and the Department of Education to review, approve, and complete the process for new standards for the state of Florida for July 1st, 2020. So what that means operationally for our schools is they will continue to administer the Florida standards / Common Core standards as we have since 2010. Those standards, the Common Core standards, were originally implemented in kindergarten, then they went kindergarten first grade, then kindergarten first, second grade, and then K-12 the following year. So it's a 4-year process. In 2013 is when they moved to the Florida standards. So with that in mind, by July 1st, 2020, we should have a sense of an adopted new standards for the state of Florida. My understanding is through a memo release that you have a copy of in your documents that by January 1st, 2020, the Department of Education is required to provide to the legislature and to the governor this recommended standards. So less than a year from now, there will be new ELA standards in grades K through 12, as well as in ELA and in math. Those are the two areas primarily of focus for the standards revision. Attendant with those standards revisions are the instructional materials, right? So we have textbooks that align to the standards. On February 15th, Chancellor Jacob Oliva announced the suspension of the instructional materials adoption for math. So beginning last fall, we had undertaken the adoption for K-8 math textbooks for the next 5 years, and as did many districts. And Chancellor Oliva has announced that the state is suspending the textbook adoption for math, given the fact that 18 months essentially after the adoption process is completed, we will have new standards. And so where we sit today is that we will continue our way of work for this year and for next year because the standards will be in complete use through June 2020. July 1 is when we get the new standards. And so not necessarily specifically addressed yet, but I think just to forewarn you will also be the conversation around state assessments. Because if our state assessments are tied to our standards and our standards are the Florida standards and those standards go away, the question becomes what assessments are used in the spring of each school year to measure student achievement in terms of proficiency and learning gains, and what that looks like in Florida. We, as you know, have a very robust accountability system that is completely based on state assessments. And that is required from the feds. Quite honestly, the U.S. Department of Education requires that every student be measured in assessments in ELA and math. Every year beginning in 3rd grade, and then once in elementary school, once in middle school, and once in high school for science. Separately from all of these issues is also the governor's interest in civic education, and that will have implications more than likely for instructional materials for all of our grades, depending on how and the extent to which those standards are written and expectations are outlined for those standards. So where we sit today is we are moving forward with the standards and the assessment we began the year with. So what we started with in August, we're rocking and rolling on, and we're going to finish this year, and we're going to have the assessments that are aligned to them. For 1920, next school year, we will continue the same standards, and we have the same assessment upon which all school grades are based for 1920. And then by January of 2020, we will have a sense of what the new standards are. that will be part of the adoption process. My sense is the State Board of Education will approve the standards by April of 2020. And then based on the approval of those standards, we will know from April to June what we need to do. Question marks for me as in my seat on the bus, in terms of instructional materials. So will there be an expectation that this district purchase all new instructional materials on July 1st, 2020 for ELA and math, K-12, because the standards will be different? Are they going to be changing funding in terms of that? We get $71 a student every year. Textbooks generally run between $90 and $140 a student every year. So if we're getting $71 and it's $280 because it's two different subjects per year per student, obviously we're going to have a shortfall. And then of course, what do we do with our students in terms of state assessments? What does that state assessment look like? Florida's assessment is very different. It's a criterion reference test that is specific to our standards. So what assessment are going to look like?